Hello, welcome to Brighter Futures, the film's about how ideas improve lives and change policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Lucy Noakes from the Department of History, who's been studying for many years as a social and cultural historian, particularly the lives of women and particularly the effects on us all from modern warfare, the long-term effects, and author of an award-winning book, Dying for a Nation. So, Lucy, welcome to the show. So do you want to tell us a bit about Dying for a Nation and what you set out to do in the book and feel has been done with it?
Sure. Thanks, Jules. So Dying for the Nation is something that I think I'd been thinking about writing for years and years, but hadn't quite dared to tackle it because I think I've always, in my research, so I've worked on war for longer than I can remember, but I think in my research I've always kind of circled around death, which is kind of at the heart of war. Dying and killing is at the heart of war. And it was, although the book focuses on the Second World War, actually the kind of impetus for the book was the kind of run-up to the centenary of the First World War. And it really made me think about how in Britain, at least, when we imagine or remember the First World War, we think about it overwhelmingly in terms of death, particularly the death of combatants. When we think about the Second World War, again, in Britain, death is very much at the margins, and yet it was absolutely central to people's experience. So what I wanted to do was to look at both the way that both the state and individuals kind of planned for war. I wanted to think about the emotional impact of war, the emotional impact in particular of grief in war, and then kind of see how, if you like, how those emotions were managed, because they definitely were managed, yeah.
Yes, and you start the book with a little vignette about a Mrs. Lane
yeah.
and her 4 sons.
Yeah.
And I thought, there it is, it is about kind of individualisation of these big processes.
Yeah.
So you're scanning from the big to the not small for her. Tell us about Mrs. Lane.
Oh, Mrs. Lane. So Mrs. Lane lost, I think, 4 of her 4 sons in the war at different points in the war. She started the war with 5 children, had 1 daughter by the end of it. But when she was interviewed by one of the papers about her enormous, unthinkable, horrible loss at the end of the war, she kind of presented herself in what I call the kind of the sort of acceptable emotional terms, what terms that would fit the emotional economy of the time, because how we talk about ourselves in emotional ways has a value or a lack of value. So she very much presented it in terms of pride. But then if you kind of read the interview carefully, there's points where her voice breaks down or where she keeps looking at the photos on the mantelpiece. And I just thought there's, the disjuncture between what was being said and what was really being said.
So there's us as social beings in a particular kind of context. So she was presumably thought she was expected to behave in a certain kind of way, but of course internally something else is going on.
Yeah, and I think she was expected to behave in a particular kind of way, because I think particularly in wartime and particularly with women and mothers, there is for the wartime state or the wartime government, there's a value in maternal grief being expressed as kind of pride in what your children, usually your sons, have done for the nation, for the military, for
greater good or whatever.
Exactly, all of that, and there's a real expectation that that's what you'll say, because that can be, if you like, that can be kind of, to put it crudely, used. And I think that often, though, when you look at that material carefully, there is other stuff going on underneath, and sometimes that's expressed in private, sometimes you find that in diaries, or you find it in recorded conversations. Sometimes you have to read in between the lines. Sometimes you find it in letters, you find it in people talking about seeing ghosts in all kinds of kind of curious and interesting ways, but it tends to find a way out, even if that way isn't kind of easily accessible on the kind of public stage, which is difficult for historians. But it just means that we have to kind of dig around a bit more.
And presumably these have long-term effects, not only on individual lives, but in the way that society and culture works over time. I mean, a country may not have had a war for a long time, a thing called a war, but in its own country, but it would have sent people to other places who died. And so people have suffered grief because of those things during that period of time. And that has that changed over time, how the expressions of that socially as well as individually? What do you find as an historian?
I think that's really interesting. So I think, yes, it has changed to an extent. I mean, we clearly live in a very different emotional economy or emotional culture in the 21st century than we did in the middle of the 20th century. Mid-20th century, the emphasis is very much on what's often called in Britain sort of stiff upper lip, stoicism, what we'd now probably, call repression. Now we're encouraged to be much more kind of in touch with our feelings, and emotions are everywhere, aren't they? Emotions are kind of drive politics really kind of vividly at the moment. So I think that there is a difference in the way that people are able to express their emotions, but I still think that there is a particular kind of political value in how emotions around loss in war are expressed. So it can both be very kind of supportive of a state, of state aims in conflict, but also, and I'm thinking particularly about some of the kind of activism around soldiers who were killed in Iraq, it can be really powerful as kind of anti-war sort of mobilisation or movement or vocalisation as well.
Which, of course, the state, whichever one it is, actually doesn't really want.
Really doesn't want,
really
no.
doesn't want. So the management of that grief and bereavement is a political process as well as a kind of social and personal one.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and I think again in Britain you can look at all the ceremonies and the traditions that have been kind of constructed and maintained around what was Armistice Day and now Remembrance Sunday, but it's also kind of Armistice Day as well now. We sort of mark that date twice. I don't think it's not just kind of, I wouldn't want to say it's just kind of constructed from the top down, because people obviously do, you're not made to participate, people obviously do get something out of it, but there's a structure kind of put in place that I think encourages the kind of the remembrance of war's dead in particular ways, and that maybe still squeezes to the margins some other ways of kind of expressing or remembering that.
So a kind of corollary of that is the expression of that and the feeling of that different for women and men? Is that too simple a kind of binary, or is it really about how kind of families and communities deal with these things? Or have women's stories in particular just been missing from history? I mean, I think, would that be something that's
women's stories have definitely been missing from history, and definitely been missing from histories of wars for a long time. So I don't know that I would say that men and women kind of feel things differently, but I think there is a bit more, certainly, I think I would certainly say that women have a bit more leeway, or have had a bit more leeway historically, to express emotion. The kind of the way that gender is sort of constructed, sometimes we're seen as kind of opposites. So if men are rational and intellectual, women are seen as kind of being driven by emotion. So there's maybe still a bit more kind of leeway for women to be expressive particularly around emotions like grief, than there is for men.
And so as an historian, would you also then be, in looking back at how these things have played out over decades, would you also be looking at kind of contemporary events and thinking, oh, that's kind of interesting, what's happening in Russia, for example, with big mobilizations and people being enforced to do something which suddenly they might see differently, but the state has another narrative altogether. So these two processes are kind of fracturing again in certain kinds of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also, again, for kind of historians of the future, that's going to be really difficult, because it's very difficult in Russia at the moment for people to actually say exactly what they think. We've kind of seen what happens when they go out in the streets and do that. They're, immediately arrested. So that's a real particular, kind of coercive emotional economy in Russia at the moment. I would say with relation to Britain, when the Queen died, and the Queen's funeral, and that kind of strange kind of interregnum, that kind of 10 days between the announcement of her death and her actual funeral, it was a very unusual atmosphere in Britain. But I'm still trying to figure out what was going on with lots of people, and there's lots of different people had lots of different motivations for kind of participating in lots of different ways. I think some of that was about people thinking about their own loss and being able to kind of give voice to that, or kind of think about that in a public setting, which we're still not actually very good at, I don't think, in this country. And part of it was also what was fascinating was the way that the British state wove a very, an individual's death into this huge kind of state narrative of kind of pomp and ceremony, and also, continuation and tradition. So
projecting forward something that's happened over a long time. I'm interested in that thing about kind of ceremony as well. I was going to say this, the rituals that we tie into bereavement and grief, and some of those will be sort of accepted norms, and others which people might feel they fit into, but others will differ over time. And does war bring something different to that space? I mean, people are, as it were, dying all the time, and there are kind of, we slot into particular rituals for them. Does it work differently around the arena of war? Is that what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to go back to Britain in the Second World War, you had kind of, so you had the already established from the First World War ritual of kind of what you do and how you, everything from kind of the whole process from the moment of death onwards for the combatant was kind of ritualised as far as possible. So the Commonwealth War Graves will be the kind of the, and Remembrance Day would be the kind of end point of how we'd ritualise and commemorate the death of the combatant. But when civilians died, and civilians died in big numbers in the Second World War, is just over 60,000 civilians die in air raids throughout the war. Really different. So you had, I found things like the government, what did they do? They said that hearses, for example, hearses had to drive at more than 20 miles an hour. Okay, so this was to stop the kind of long traditional slow funeral procession where somebody would walk in front of the hearse, because and you had lots of kind of mass funerals, and mass burials, which were really unpopular most of the time. Yes. Partly an attempt
because it was too big of an expression of failure?
I think it was. I think they were trying to do two things. I think they were both in those kind of big mass burials, and the one time I can think where that kind of worked and was accepted by the bereaved was in Coventry after the big air raid on Coventry in November 1940, and not all, but well over half of the victims of that air raid are buried in two mass graves in Coventry, and that was agreed by their family. But more often than not, when there was an attempt to bury people together, people said no, because partly there was a kind of connotations of the kind of unmarked mass pauper's grave, and a lot of them were people who were killed were in the kind of poorer working class areas. But I think the government wanted to do that for two reasons. I think firstly was to avoid what they saw as being the kind of impact on morale of repeated individual funerals, just following on one after the other. And the other was they wanted to somehow kind of connote the whole idea of sacrifice that's attached to the soldier by burying civilians together as kind of, sacrificial victims of war.
Right. So there is this there are these two arenas, one where the war is being fought out and one with here, with what's happened to people. It did strike me about kind of what happened during COVID. I mean, it's not a war, but it's a period of high levels of death. But that's all happening in kind of one arena. That's very different from a war context. But then people were equally prevented from going to funerals or had to have small ones. We have to do the same. Small.
Yeah, we attended a funeral by Zoom, which was pretty horrible. And the other thing that I think that, we were told again and again that we'd got to kind of, remember our grandparents or great-grandparents' kind of blitz spirit. But a lot of that was both about kind of stoicism, but it was also about, and I think probably more valuable, the idea of kind of community and putting other people before ourselves. So I think there was a lot of kind of reflecting back, and of course we saw that in the Queen's speech that she made in, I think, March or April 2020.
Yeah, yes. So that kind of public expression is also trying, in a sense, in a normative way, trying to change the way that the public thinks and feels about a set of events. State is intervening, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we turn it round, it might be a bit difficult to think in this way, but what would you be saying from your research for Dying for the Nation you would think could or ought to change when it comes to thinking about policy arenas? Now, it might be super local. It might be how we think about these ceremonies in communities, in towns, in villages, or it might be how we just talk about these things slightly differently, tell stories about them.
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot of resistance to kind of changing the ceremonies around, particularly around remembrance of the military dead, because that's become, over more than 100 years now, it's become such a kind of established and kind of by many people kind of valued and ritualised part of our kind of national calendar. But I absolutely think that it is time that we kind of think a bit more about how we talk about death and how we support the bereaved. I think we absolutely should, and I include the kind of military bereaved in that, because their families are not just proud, they're also grieving.
Yeah.
And I think we need to kind of think a lot about the kind of both the language and the support that we offer.
Yes. Thank you very much. Lucy Noakes from the Department of History. Been a pleasure talking. You've been watching a Brighter Futures film about how ideas improve lives. For more conversations on these topics, pop over to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.